My name is Emma Carter, and for most of my life, I believed family meant loyalty. I was wrong. The night my grandmother died, my parents didn't cry. They didn't talk about her kindness. They didn't remember the woman who had spent 40 years helping everyone around her. Instead, they locked themselves inside her study before the funeral arrangements had even begun. At first, I thought they were overwhelmed. Maybe they were organizing paperwork. Maybe they were trying to deal with lawyers. But then I heard something through the half-open door that changed everything. Make sure Emma never sees the original copy. My father's voice was calm. Cold. Like he'd been waiting for this moment. My mother's reply came only seconds later. Relax. By the time she finds out, it'll be too late. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. They were talking about Grandma's will. I wanted to believe I'd misunderstood. Maybe there was another explanation. Maybe grief was making me paranoid. But deep inside, something felt horribly wrong. I quietly walked away before they noticed me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every memory of Grandma replayed inside my mind. She had always treated me differently, not because she loved me more than anyone else, but because she believed honesty mattered more than comfort. She used to tell me, people reveal who they truly are when money enters the room. At the time, I laughed. Now those words echoed louder than ever. Grandma Eleanor wasn't rich in the billionaire sense. But after Grandpa passed away, she inherited several apartment buildings, farmland outside the city, investments, and the old Carter family estate. People estimated everything together was worth nearly $12 million. Enough to destroy a family. Enough to expose everyone's true face. Including my parents. Growing up, my relationship with my parents had always been complicated. Nothing I ever accomplished seemed good enough. When I graduated from law school, my father barely congratulated me. When I bought my own apartment without asking anyone for help, my mother simply asked, "Is that really the best neighborhood you could afford?" Meanwhile, my younger brother Daniel could do absolutely nothing wrong. He quit 3 different jobs. Crashed 2 expensive cars. Spent money like water. Yet somehow, he remained the favorite. Grandma noticed it too. She often defended me whenever family dinners became uncomfortable. One Christmas, after Dad criticized my career choice for almost 20 minutes, Grandma finally slammed her fork onto the table. Emma built her own life. She looked directly at my father. When will Daniel build his? Nobody said another word that night. Daniel stormed out. Dad refused to speak to Grandma for almost a month. But she never apologized. Because she knew she was right. 3 weeks before she died, Grandma unexpectedly invited me to spend the weekend at her house. It was just the 2 of us. We cooked together. Played cards. Sat on the porch watching the rain. She seemed unusually thoughtful. Almost like she was preparing for something. Late that evening she handed me a small silver key. "This belongs to the oak desk in my library." I frowned. "What does it open?" She smiled. "You'll know when it's time." I laughed. "You sound mysterious." She squeezed my hand. "Sometimes the truth needs patience." I slipped the key into my purse and forgot about it. At least, I thought I did. After Grandma's funeral, my parents insisted everyone meet at the lawyer's office 2 days later. Dad seemed strangely confident. Almost cheerful. Daniel was already talking about selling the family estate before the meeting had even started. Mom discussed luxury vacations she'd always wanted. No one spoke about Grandma. Only her money. I sat quietly. Watching. Listening. Trying to ignore the knot forming inside my stomach. When the lawyer finally entered the conference room carrying a thick leather folder, everyone immediately straightened in their chairs. He introduced himself, cleared his throat, then began reading the will. The first few pages sounded perfectly normal. Charitable donations, specific gifts to friends, family heirlooms. Then came the property division. According to the document, nearly everything belonged to my parents. The estate, the investments, the rental buildings, even Grandma's jewelry. I received nothing. Not a single dollar. Not even one family photograph. Daniel couldn't hide his smile. Mom reached for Dad's hand beneath the table. Dad looked almost relieved. The lawyer glanced toward me. His expression seemed confused, as though he expected a different reaction. I wasn't angry. I was shocked. Because I knew Grandma. She would never have left me out completely. Never. Something wasn't right. Then I remembered. The silver key. Still sitting inside my purse. Exactly where Grandma had left it. And suddenly, her final words echoed inside my head once again. Sometimes the truth needs patience. At that exact moment, I realized Grandma had planned for this. She knew something would happen after her death. She knew someone would try to change the story. What I didn't know was just how far my own parents had gone. Or why they had been so desperate to keep me away from the original documents. I stood up from my chair, ignored everyone's confused expressions, reached into my purse, and wrapped my fingers around the cold silver key. What happened next destroyed my parents' perfect plan forever. I tightened my grip around the small silver key inside my purse. It suddenly felt heavier than a piece of metal should. The lawyer was still speaking, but his voice faded into the background. My parents were smiling politely, accepting everyone's condolences while quietly celebrating what they believed was their victory. I couldn't stay in that room another second. I need some air, I said softly. No one tried to stop me. In fact, they barely noticed me leave. That hurt more than I expected. To them, I was already out of the picture. As I drove toward Grandma Eleanor's house, memories flooded my mind. She had taught me to ride a bicycle in the driveway. She had baked apple pies every Sunday. She had always said that every old house carried two things, memories and secrets. Back then, I thought she was talking about hidden photo albums. Now, I wasn't so sure. The house was eerily quiet. The funeral flowers still lined the front porch. A gentle breeze swayed the wind chimes Grandma loved so much. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the front door. It didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a crime scene. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Everything was exactly as she had left it. Her favorite blanket rested on the couch. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay on the coffee table. Her reading glasses were still beside the lamp. It was as if she might walk into the room at any moment. I swallowed hard and made my way toward the library. The library had always been Grandma's favorite room. Dark oak shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Hundreds of books filled every wall. In the center stood the massive antique desk she had inherited from her father. The oak desk. Exactly the one she had mentioned. My hands trembled as I inserted the silver key into a tiny keyhole hidden beneath the center drawer. Click. A faint mechanical sound echoed through the room. But the drawer didn't open. I heard another click somewhere inside the desk. Confused, I searched every corner until I noticed one of the carved wooden panels had shifted slightly. It wasn't a drawer. It was a hidden compartment. Grandma had built a secret compartment into her desk. My heart raced as I carefully slid the panel open. Inside sat a small leather box. Alongside it was a sealed envelope. Across the front, written in Grandma's elegant handwriting, were 6 words that made my breath catch. For Emma, if they betray you. My knees nearly gave out. She knew. She had known all along. With shaky fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. My dearest Emma. If you are reading this, then my greatest fear has become reality. Someone has tried to change my final wishes. Tears blurred my vision. I kept reading. I hope I was wrong. But if I wasn't, then remember this. The truth is never kept inside the first document people show you. Look deeper. Trust the people who ask questions, not the ones demanding quick signatures. Most importantly, do not let them destroy the last page. The last page? I frowned. I quickly opened the leather box. Inside were several documents tied together with a faded blue ribbon. At the very top was another copy of Grandma's will. An original copy. I immediately flipped to the final pages. Page 1. Page 2. Page 3. Everything matched the version the lawyer had read. Then I reached the end. The page numbers stopped at 6. But according to the table of contents, there should have been 7 pages. Page 7 was gone. Someone had removed it. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't an accident. Someone had carefully taken only the final page. The page Grandma specifically warned me about. I searched the box again. Underneath the will were photographs, bank statements, property deeds, old letters. Then something unexpected caught my attention. A tiny digital voice recorder. Its battery light blinked weakly. I hesitated before pressing play. Static filled the room. Then, Grandma's voice. Soft. Calm. Fragile. If you're hearing this, Emma, I may already be gone. Fresh tears rolled down my cheeks. I couldn't trust paper anymore. I knew paper could disappear. But voices, they're harder to erase. My heartbeat accelerated. Grandma continued. Several months ago, your parents visited me. They believed I was becoming forgetful. They brought legal documents for me to sign. They told me they were simple estate updates. I felt sick. They lied. I pretended not to notice. But after they left, I had my attorney compare those papers with my original will. They had already begun changing everything. I covered my mouth in horror. They underestimated 2 things. My memory. And my patience. The recording continued. So I prepared another plan. If they replace my will. If they pressure my attorney. If they hide the final page. They'll still lose. Lose? How? Before Grandma could explain, the recording suddenly stopped. The battery had died. No. I pressed the button again. Nothing. The recorder was completely dead. I searched the desk for charging cables, batteries, anything. Nothing. The rest of Grandma's explanation was trapped inside that silent device. Just then, a loud floorboard creaked somewhere behind me. I froze. I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned toward the library door. For a second, no one was there. Then I noticed a shadow disappear down the hallway. Someone had been watching me. I rushed into the hall. Hello? Silence. The front door slammed shut. By the time I reached the porch, all I saw was a black SUV speeding away from the house. I recognized it instantly. It belonged to my father. My stomach dropped. He had followed me. Which meant he knew about the library. He knew about the hidden desk. And now he knew that I had found something. As I walked back inside, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. Dinner at our house tonight. We need to discuss your grandmother's estate. I stared at the screen. For the first time in my life. Those words didn't sound like an invitation. They sounded like a warning. I looked back at Grandma's desk. The missing last page. The unfinished recording. The hidden documents. Whatever was written on that final page. My parents were terrified that I would find it. And I had a feeling. They were willing to do far more than lie to keep it hidden. That night, I never went to my parents' house. Instead, I turned my phone off and sat alone in Grandma's library, staring at the leather box spread across the desk. The missing page. The interrupted voice recording. The black SUV speeding away. None of it felt random anymore. Someone wasn't just hiding the truth. Someone was racing against me. I carefully gathered every document from the hidden compartment and placed them into my backpack. If my father had already searched the library once, there was no reason to believe he wouldn't come back. Before leaving, I looked around the room one last time. Grandma always said, if someone wants you to look in one direction, the answer is usually behind you. I walked to the bookshelf behind her desk. At first, nothing looked unusual. Then I noticed one book sitting backward. It wasn't even a real book. It was a hollow storage box. Inside was a small envelope containing a single business card. Richard Hayes. Attorney at law. On the back, in Grandma's handwriting, were 4 simple words. Trust only Richard. Alone. The next morning, I arrived at Richard Hayes' office before it opened. The receptionist looked surprised. Mr. Hayes isn't seeing anyone today. Tell him Emma Carter is here. A few moments later, the office door flew open. Richard Hayes looked pale. Almost frightened. Emma. He quickly ushered me inside and locked the door. Locked it. That was the first sign something was terribly wrong. Without saying a word, he walked to the window, pulled the blinds closed, and turned on a small radio sitting on a shelf. Static filled the room. I looked at him, confused. Why are you doing that? He exhaled slowly. To make sure nobody can listen. A chill crawled down my spine. He sat across from me. I've been expecting you. You knew I'd come? I hoped you would. He looked exhausted, as if he hadn't slept in days. I also hoped you'd come before your parents did. My heart skipped a beat. They've already been here? He nodded. Twice. I leaned forward. What did they want? They wanted me to confirm that the wool raid at your grandmother's estate meeting was authentic. Were you able to? Richard looked directly into my eyes. No. Silence filled the room. What do you mean, no? Because it wasn't the will I prepared. The words hit me like a truck. My chest tightened. So. The document read after your grandmother's funeral was altered. I struggled to process what I had just heard. But everyone signed it. Richard nodded. They signed a copy. A copy? Not the original. He opened a locked cabinet behind his desk and removed a thick file. Inside were several legal drafts. He placed one in front of me. This was the first version your grandmother approved. Another document. This was the second revision. Then another. And this. He hesitated. Was the final version. I quickly compared it to the copy from Grandma's hidden desk. They matched perfectly. Except. The final page was missing from both. I looked up. Where is page 7? Richard's expression darkened. I don't know. He rubbed his forehead. It disappeared the day before your grandmother died. I stared at him. Disappeared? My office was broken into. My office was broken into. I felt my stomach drop. They didn't steal computers. They didn't take money. They ignored every valuable item. They took one thing. The last page. I whispered. So someone knew exactly what they were looking for. Richard nodded. They did. I pulled Grandma's letter from my backpack and handed it to him. He read it silently. When he finished, he closed his eyes. She knew. Knew what? That someone inside her own family would betray her. I swallowed hard. Did she ever tell you who? He shook his head. No. But she gave me instructions. What instructions? If anything happened to her, I was to wait. Wait for what? For you. Richard reached into another drawer and removed a small sealed envelope. Across the front was my name. The handwriting was unmistakable. Grandma's. You've had this the whole time? I promised her I wouldn't give it to anyone unless two conditions were met. What conditions? First, she had to be gone. And second, you had to come here alone. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten note. It contained only one sentence. The last page was never the real inheritance. I frowned. What did that mean? There was another line underneath. Follow the lighthouse. I blinked. Lighthouse? There wasn't a lighthouse anywhere near our town. At least, not anymore. Richard suddenly stood up. I need to show you something. He unlocked a filing cabinet and removed an old photograph. It showed Grandma standing beside a weathered stone lighthouse overlooking the ocean. I recognized the place immediately. It had been abandoned for nearly 20 years. Grandpa used to take us there when I was little. No one had mentioned it in years. Richard pointed toward the picture. Your grandmother bought that property 6 months ago. I stared at him. She bought it back? He nodded. In cash. But why? I asked her the same question. What did she say? He smiled sadly. Because some things are safer where everyone believes there's nothing left to find. Before I could ask another question, Richard's office phone rang. He ignored it. Then his cell phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. His face lost all color. What is it? He slowly turned the phone toward me. The caller ID read. Michael Carter. My father. Richard declined the call. Seconds later, it rang again. Then again. Then a text message appeared. Richard read it silently. His hands started shaking. I reached for the phone. What does it say? He hesitated. Finally, he handed it to me. The message read. If Emma is with you, tell her to stop looking. Some secrets should stay buried. Below it was another line. One that made my blood run cold. The lighthouse isn't safe anymore. I looked up at Richard. Neither of us had ever mentioned the lighthouse. Not to anyone. Not over the phone. Not in writing. Only the two of us had spoken about it. Inside a locked office. Which meant one terrifying possibility. Someone wasn't just following us. Someone was listening. Richard slowly walked to the bookshelf, reached behind it, and pulled out a tiny electronic device no larger than a coin. A hidden microphone. He looked at me with fear in his eyes. They've been one step ahead of us. This entire time. Richard didn't waste another second. He ripped the tiny microphone from behind the bookshelf and crushed it beneath his shoe. The room fell silent. For several moments, neither of us spoke. If someone had planted a listening device inside a respected attorney's private office, this was no longer just a family dispute. It was a carefully planned operation. They know we're going to the lighthouse, I whispered. Richard nodded grimly. Which means they'll probably get there first. My pulse quickened. Then we leave now. The abandoned lighthouse stood nearly 2 hours outside the city, overlooking a rocky stretch of coastline where crashing waves drowned out almost every other sound. As we drove, dark clouds rolled across the sky. Rain began to fall. The closer we got, the more memories returned. I hadn't been there since I was 12. Back then, Grandpa would bring Grandma and me every summer. We'd climb to the top, eat sandwiches overlooking the ocean, and watch ships disappear into the horizon. It had always felt magical. Now, it felt haunted. When the lighthouse finally appeared through the fog, it looked older than I remembered. Its white paint had peeled away. Broken windows stared out like empty eyes. The iron gate hung crooked on rusted hinges. The place had been abandoned for years. Or so everyone believed. We parked 100 yards away. Richard stopped me before we walked toward the entrance. Listen. At first, I heard nothing. Then, a car door slammed somewhere nearby. We weren't alone. Richard pointed toward fresh tire tracks leading behind the lighthouse. Someone had arrived only minutes earlier. My stomach tightened. My parents. Maybe, Richard replied. Or someone working for them. We moved quietly, staying close to the overgrown bushes until we reached the back of the building. There, hidden behind tall weeds, stood a black luxury SUV. The same one I'd seen leaving Grandma's house. Dad was here. The front door of the lighthouse was slightly open. Inside, muddy footprints led toward a spiral staircase. Everything smelled of salt water, damp wood, and decades of neglect. Richard whispered. We stay together. I nodded. Every creak beneath our feet echoed through the empty tower. Halfway up the stairs, I noticed something carved into the wall. It was old. Very old. The words had almost faded away. Truth rises with the tide. I froze. I've seen this before. Richard looked surprised. Where? Grandma's journal. She used to write that exact sentence beneath every important entry. This wasn't random. It was another clue. At the top of the lighthouse was the old lantern room. The massive glass windows overlooked the crashing ocean. Rain hammered against the panes. The room looked completely empty. Dad wasn't there. Neither was anyone else. Richard frowned. This doesn't make sense. Then I remembered something. Grandpa had once joked that the lighthouse had 2 foundations. One people could see. And one they couldn't. I slowly looked toward the floor. Most of the wooden planks were covered in dust. Except one section. A perfect square. Someone had recently wiped it clean. I knelt down and ran my fingers across the edges. There. A tiny metal ring. Hidden between 2 boards. I pulled. The floor lifted open. Beneath it was a narrow staircase leading underground. The air below was cold. Stone walls surrounded a small underground chamber. It wasn't large. But it was carefully built. This place wasn't part of the original lighthouse. Someone had constructed it later. In the center of the room stood a steel lockbox bolted into the floor. Across the lid was an engraved brass plate. Eleanor Carter. Below her name were 7 words. The truth belongs to the honest. I stared at it in disbelief. This is what she wanted us to find. Richard smiled. I think you're right. But before either of us could touch the box, a voice echoed from behind us. I wouldn't do that. We turned. My father stood at the top of the stairs. My mother beside him. Daniel behind them. None of them looked surprised. Only angry. Dad slowly descended the stairs. So, You finally figured it out. I stepped protectively in front of the lockbox. You've been following me. Dad didn't deny it. You should have stopped asking questions. You changed Grandma's will. He laughed. No. We corrected it. The words hit me like ice. Corrected? Mom folded her arms. Your grandmother wasn't thinking clearly near the end. Richard stepped forward. That's a lie. Dad ignored him. He looked directly at me. You've always believed you deserved everything. I never wanted her money. No? Dad smirked. Then step away from the box. I didn't move. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Only the sound of waves crashing against the rocks echoed through the chamber. Then Daniel suddenly lunged toward me. He grabbed my arm, trying to pull me away. I shoved him back. He stumbled into the stone wall. The room exploded into shouting. Richard tried to separate us. Mom screamed. Dad reached for the lockbox. In the chaos, his foot struck a loose stone. He lost his balance. The heavy steel box shifted. With a loud metallic crack, one of its side panels broke open. Dozens of yellow envelopes spilled across the floor. Everyone froze. They weren't cash. They weren't property deeds. They were letters. Every envelope had a different name written across the front. Judges. Doctors. Business partners. Charities. Friends. Even my father's name. Grandma had written dozens of personal letters before she died. One envelope immediately caught my eye. Across the front, in bold handwriting, were the words, "To whoever opens this box." I slowly picked it up. Dad shouted, "Don't." For the first time all day. He sounded afraid. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded page. At the top, Grandma had written, "If this box has been opened in the presence of those who altered my will." I looked up. Dad's face turned completely white. Grandma had anticipated this exact moment. And whatever came next. My parents clearly never expected anyone to read, for a long moment. No one moved. The only sound inside the underground chamber was the wind howling through the cracks in the old lighthouse. My hands trembled as I unfolded Grandma's letter. My father took one step forward. "Emma, don't." His voice was no longer confident. It was desperate. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Not sadness. Not regret. Fear. I looked at him. "You've been waiting for Grandma to stay silent." I held the letter tighter. "She isn't." Then I began to read. "If this box has been opened in the presence of those who altered my final wishes, then my plan has worked exactly as intended." A heavy silence filled the room. Grandma's words continued. "My children, if you are standing here, you have already made the greatest mistake of your lives." Mom's face lost all color. Dad clenched his fists. "Money has never been the inheritance I wanted to leave behind. Character was. Unfortunately, you chose greed instead." I looked up. Neither of my parents could meet my eyes. I kept reading. For months before my death, I suspected someone was trying to pressure me into changing my will. So I stopped trusting conversations. I trusted evidence. Richard slowly smiled. He already knew what she meant. But my parents didn't. Not yet. Every meeting inside my house. Every document brought to me. Every signature requested. Every argument. Every threat. Was secretly recorded. Daniel's face turned pale. Dad whispered, "No." Grandma continued, I installed cameras inside my study, audio recorders beneath my desk, and duplicate copies of every document in secure locations. I looked toward Richard. He nodded. She told me she was creating a complete legal record. My father exploded. She had no right. Richard answered calmly. Actually, it was her house. She had every right. I unfolded the second page. To my attorney, Richard Hayes. If you are hearing these words, then thank you for honoring your promise. Richard lowered his head. You never told us this, I whispered. I promised I wouldn't. Grandma's letter continued. The recordings inside this box should be delivered to the probate court immediately if anyone presents a false version of my will. Dad suddenly lunged toward me. Give me that letter. Before he could reach me, Richard stepped between us. You touch her, and I'll have you arrested before sunset. Dad stopped. But his breathing grew heavier. I looked inside the steel box. Beneath the letters were dozens of neatly labeled flash drives. Each one carried a date. January 14th. February 3rd. March 21st. April 18th. Almost 6 months' worth of recordings. Mom covered her mouth. She finally understood. Grandma hadn't simply suspected them. She had documented everything. Every lie. Every manipulation. Every secret meeting. I picked up one flash drive labeled The First Offer. Richard removed a small laptop from his bag. I brought this just in case. He inserted the drive. The screen flickered to life. Seconds later, Grandma's study appeared. The date stamp showed 4 months before her death. There sat Grandma. Across from her, my parents. Dad slid several documents across the table. His voice filled the underground chamber. Mother, you don't need all these complicated legal papers. We've already prepared everything. Grandma smiled politely. I'd like Richard to review them first. Dad's expression hardened. That isn't necessary. Mom leaned forward. Emma doesn't need to know anything about this. My stomach twisted. The recording continued. Grandma quietly asked. Why? Dad answered without hesitation. Because she'll only interfere. Silence. Grandma folded her hands. Then she asked one question. If I refuse? Dad laughed. You won't. The video ended. Nobody spoke. Daniel looked horrified. I never knew. He turned toward Dad. You told me she wanted everything simplified. Dad avoided his gaze. You lied to me too? Mom reached for Daniel. Honey. He stepped away. No. You used me. For the first time. The family they had carefully controlled began falling apart. I opened another envelope. Inside was yet another handwritten letter. This one was addressed directly to my father. I handed it to him. He stared at it for several seconds before finally opening it. As he read, his shoulders slowly sank. Tears gathered in his eyes. Mom whispered. What does it say? He couldn't answer. His hands shook too violently. The paper slipped to the floor. I picked it up. Grandma had written. Michael. I forgave your mistakes many times. I forgave your anger. Your pride. Even your distance. But I cannot forgive teaching your own children that love has a price. That lesson ends with me. Dad quietly sat down on the cold stone floor. For the first time. He looked like a broken man. Just as I thought everything was over. Richard reached deeper into the steel box. There appears to be one final envelope. It was thicker than the others. Across the front, Grandma had written, "Read this only after the truth is exposed." I carefully opened it. Inside was the missing final page of the will. Page 7. Perfectly preserved. Untouched. My heart pounded. Grandma hadn't lost the last page. She had hidden it herself. The page my parents had searched for. The page they believed they had destroyed. Had been waiting here all along. I slowly looked up. My parents stared at it in complete disbelief. Dad whispered only 2 words. "Impossible." I took a deep breath. Then I turned the page over. The first sentence made everyone in the room freeze. "This inheritance shall belong only to the family member who refuses to fight for my money." And suddenly, everything Grandma had done finally began to make sense. The underground chamber fell completely silent. No one breathed. No one moved. The missing final page rested in my trembling hands. 4 months. My parents had searched for it. They had altered documents. Pressured lawyers. Lied to family members. Followed me across the city. And now, the very page they believed had vanished forever was finally in front of them. My father stared at it as though it were a ghost. Mom whispered, "Emma, please." But I wasn't listening anymore. I unfolded the page and began to read. To my family. If you are hearing these words, then the final page has finally been found. That means my children allowed greed to become louder than love. I prayed that would never happen. Sadly, I also prepared for it. I swallowed hard and continued. The person who receives my estate will not be chosen by birth order. Nor by age. Nor by who believes they deserve it. Everything I own shall belong only to the family member who refuses to fight for my money. Daniel looked confused. Dad closed his eyes. Grandma had known exactly what would happen. She knew greed would expose the truth long before any lawyer could. The next paragraph made my heart ache. When Emma visited me 3 weeks before my passing, she never once asked about my estate. She never asked how much I owned. She only asked whether I was sleeping better, whether my medicine was helping, and whether I felt lonely. Tears blurred my vision. I remembered that weekend. We had baked apple pie, played cards, watched the rain from the porch. Not once had we talked about money. Grandma noticed. She always noticed. I kept reading. Michael. Daniel. I gave both of you opportunities to speak to me about love. Instead, you spoke about property. You asked which apartment building would be sold first. Which investment accounts would mature next year. How quickly the estate could be divided. Dad lowered his head. Daniel's face turned bright red. I didn't know. His voice cracked. I thought. You thought what? I asked quietly. He looked at Dad. I thought Grandma wanted us to help organize everything. Dad said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say. Richard stepped closer. Emma. There's another section. I nodded and continued reading. The legal ownership of my estate shall transfer to Emma Carter. Only after the probate court confirms that she did not participate in altering this will. Richard smiled. That condition has already been satisfied. My father looked up in disbelief. What? Richard calmly explained. Your mother's recordings, the original drafts, the hidden documents, and this final page prove Emma had no involvement. He paused. But they also prove someone else did. Dad's shoulders slumped. The fight had finally left him. Then came the sentence none of us expected. However, Emma, if you are reading this, I ask one final thing of you. I stopped. The room was so quiet I could hear the waves crashing against the cliffs outside. Do not punish your family with the same bitterness they showed you. Justice is not revenge. If the law must act, let it. But do not let hatred become your inheritance. A tear rolled down my cheek. Even after everything. Grandma's final lesson wasn't about money. It was about mercy. For several minutes, no one spoke. Then, something happened that I never imagined. Played cards. Watched the rain from the porch. Not once had we talked about money. Grandma noticed. She always noticed. I kept reading. Michael. Daniel. I gave both of you opportunities to speak to me about love. Instead, you spoke about property. You asked which apartment building would be sold first. Which investment accounts would mature next year. How quickly the estate could be divided. Dad lowered his head. Daniel's face turned bright red. I didn't know. His voice cracked. I thought. You thought what? I asked quietly. He looked at Dad. I thought Grandma wanted us to help organize everything. Dad said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say. Richard stepped closer. Emma. There's another section. I nodded and continued reading. The legal ownership of my estate shall transfer to Emma Carter. Only after the probate court confirms that she did not participate in altering this will. Richard smiled. That condition has already been satisfied. My father looked up in disbelief. What? Richard calmly explained. Your mother's recordings, the original drafts, the hidden documents, and this final page prove Emma had no involvement. He paused. But they also prove someone else did. Dad's shoulders slumped. The fight had finally left him. Then came the sentence none of us expected. However, Emma, if you are reading this, I ask one final thing of you. I stopped. The room was so quiet I could hear the waves crashing against the cliffs outside. Do not punish your family with the same bitterness they showed you. Justice is not revenge. If the law must act, let it. But do not let hatred become your inheritance. A tear rolled down my cheek. Even after everything. Grandma's final lesson wasn't about money. It was about mercy. For several minutes, no one spoke. Then, something happened that I never imagined. My father slowly stood. He walked toward me. Not with anger. Not with pride. But with the exhaustion of a man who had spent years pretending to be someone he wasn't. He looked at the floor before finally speaking. I was jealous. His voice barely rose above a whisper. I was jealous of my own mother. I stared at him. When your grandfather died, I thought everything would finally become mine. But your grandmother kept making her own decisions. She trusted Richard. She trusted charities. And eventually, he looked directly at me. She trusted you. Mom quietly began crying. Dad continued. I convinced myself she loved you more. So when she started talking about changing her will, I panicked. I told myself I was protecting the family. He shook his head. But the truth, I was protecting my own pride. Daniel wiped tears from his face. I should have asked Grandma what she wanted. I never did. I only listened to Dad. Mom stepped forward. Her voice was shaking. Emma, I know saying sorry isn't enough. It isn't, I answered honestly. She nodded. I know. Richard carefully gathered the documents and placed them back inside the steel box. I'll deliver everything to the court tomorrow morning. Dad didn't argue. Neither did Mom. For the first time, They accepted that the truth could no longer be hidden. As we prepared to leave, I noticed something tucked beneath the bottom of the lockbox. A tiny velvet pouch. I opened it. Inside was Grandma's wedding ring, along with a small handwritten note. Some treasures should never be divided. I slipped the ring into my hand. It wasn't the most valuable thing Grandma owned. Not even close. But somehow, it felt more precious than the entire estate. Because unlike money, it carried love instead of conflict. As we climbed the stairs and stepped out into the fading evening light, I looked back one last time at the hidden chamber beneath the lighthouse. The secret had finally been uncovered. The lies had finally been exposed. I thought the story was over. I was wrong. Because the very next morning, the probate court made a discovery that no one, including Richard, had ever expected. And that discovery would change the Carter family forever. The next morning, Richard and I arrived at the probate court just after 9. The steel lockbox sat between us on the conference table. Inside were Grandma Eleanor's recordings, letters, the original will, and the missing 7th page. Everything she had spent months protecting. Everything my parents had tried to hide. As the court clerk carefully removed each document, I couldn't stop thinking about Grandma's final words. Justice is not revenge. I repeated them silently. Over and over. Because I had a feeling I was about to need them. Judge Helen Morris entered the room carrying a thick case file. She greeted Richard with a nod before looking toward me. Miss Carter, your grandmother was remarkably thorough. Richard smiled faintly. That sounds like Eleanor. The judge opened the file. I reviewed the recordings last night. She paused. They clearly show attempts to pressure Mrs. Carter into changing her estate plan. My heart sank. Hearing it from a judge made everything feel painfully real. Then Judge Morris looked at another folder. There is, however, something even more concerning. Richard frowned. What is it? The judge slowly slid several bank statements across the table. These were found during our review of Mrs. Carter's financial records. I looked down. Thousands of dollars had been transferred out of Grandma's accounts over several years. Some transfers were small. $500. $1,000. $3,000. Others were much larger. $50,000. $100,000. $200,000. The total at the bottom of the page made my breath catch. $1,840,000. Nearly $2 million. Gone. Richard adjusted his glasses. These withdrawals were never authorized. The judge nodded. They were signed using powers of attorney. I frowned. But Grandma never mentioned giving anyone power of attorney. She didn't. The judge placed another document on the table. The signatures were forged. The room fell silent. Forged. Not altered. Not manipulated. Forged. An investigator entered carrying another file. We've confirmed the handwriting analysis. He looked directly at me. The signatures on 32 financial documents do not belong to Eleanor Carter. He turned another page. They belong to the same individual. I already knew the answer. Before he even spoke. Michael Carter. My father. I closed my eyes. For a brief moment. I wasn't thinking about the money. I wasn't thinking about the estate. I was remembering a little girl who used to run into her father's arms after school. A father who carried me on his shoulders. Who taught me how to ride a bike. Who tucked me into bed every night. When had that man disappeared? Or had I simply never known who he truly was? Later that afternoon, detectives executed a search warrant on my parents' home. Richard and I waited outside. An hour passed. Then 2. Finally, one of the detectives walked toward us carrying several cardboard evidence boxes. "What did you find?" Richard asked. The detective looked grim. "Much more than we expected." Inside the boxes were hidden ledgers and signed deeds, offshore account documents, and stacks of correspondence with financial advisors. One folder immediately caught my attention. Its label read, "Eleanor, Estate Transition." Richard opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten checklist. Each item had been crossed off. Gain access to financial records. Prepare revised estate documents. Heavy check mark. Isolate Emma from legal meetings. Heavy check mark. Convince Daniel everything is temporary. Heavy check mark. Secure final signature. Cross mark. The last item wasn't checked. Instead, someone had written in red ink, "Page 7 missing." Dad had never found it. That evening, my father was brought in for questioning. He wasn't arrested immediately. The investigators wanted a statement first. Hours later, Richard asked me a question I never expected. "Would you like to speak with him?" I hesitated. "I don't know. You may never get another chance before formal charges are filed." I stared at the interrogation room through the one-way glass. Dad looked older. Smaller. Like the weight of every lie had finally settled onto his shoulders. I took a deep breath. "I'll talk to him." When I entered the room, he didn't look up. For nearly a minute, we sat in silence. Finally, he spoke. "I suppose you hate me now." I answered honestly. "I don't know what I feel." He nodded slowly. "That's fair." He looked at his hands. I kept telling myself I was borrowing the money. Borrowing? I planned to pay it back. When? He didn't answer. Instead, tears filled his eyes. The business was failing. I made one bad investment after another. I thought if I could just recover. "You forged Grandma's name." "I know." "You lied to all of us." "I know." "You tried to steal her legacy." His voice broke. "I know." I wanted to yell. To demand answers. To ask why none of us had been enough. But then I remembered Grandma's note. "Do not let hatred become your inheritance." So instead I asked the only question that truly mattered. "Why didn't you ask Grandma for help?" Dad covered his face. "Because I couldn't bear admitting I had failed." There it was. Not greed. Not at first. Pride. A lifetime of pride that had slowly turned into dishonesty. Then fraud. Then betrayal. Before I left, Dad called my name. "Emma." I stopped. "If the court gives you everything, I hope you become the kind of person your grandmother believed you already were." For the first time. His words didn't sound manipulative. They sounded like regret. Real regret. 3 weeks later, the probate court announced its decision. The original 7-page will was declared valid. Every altered document was thrown out. The estate legally belonged to me. But before the judge finalized the transfer, she asked one final question. "Miss Carter, what do you intend to do with your grandmother's legacy?" I looked down at Grandma's wedding ring resting in my hand. Then I smiled. Because I already knew the answer. And it wasn't what anyone in that courtroom expected. The courtroom was silent. Judge Helen Morris looked at me patiently. "Miss Carter, what do you intend to do with your grandmother's estate?" Every pair of eyes turned toward me. The attorneys. The court staff. Richard. My parents. Daniel. Everyone expected the same answer. That I would keep everything. After everything I had been through. No one would have blamed me. But then I remembered Grandma's smile as we sat on her porch 3 weeks before she died. "Money doesn't tell people who you are," she had said. "It only makes it impossible to hide." I stood slowly. "I'd like to make a statement." The judge nodded. "You may." I looked first at my father. Then at my mother. Finally at Daniel. I spent weeks believing this story was about an inheritance. It wasn't. It was about choices. My parents chose fear. They chose pride. They chose secrets. And every one of those choices cost them something far more valuable than money. I paused. They lost trust. Neither of my parents looked up. I turned toward the judge. "My grandmother left me an estate worth millions. But that isn't the greatest gift she gave me. The greatest gift was showing me the kind of person I never want to become." A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. I continued. "Therefore, I will honor her wishes exactly as she intended." Over the following months, lawyers finalized the transfer of the estate. The newspapers briefly covered the unusual inheritance case. Neighbors whispered. Old family friends called. Everyone wanted to know what I would do with the money. Some assumed I would sell everything. Others believed I would disappear and start a new life somewhere far away. Instead, I drove back to Grandma's house. The first thing I did was unlock the front door. For the first time since her funeral, it felt like home again. I walked into her library, placed her wedding ring inside the glass cabinet beside Grandpa's photograph. Then I whispered, "We did it, Grandma." The months that followed were filled with difficult decisions. I chose not to sell the family estate. Instead, I restored it. The old farmhouse was repaired. The gardens bloomed again. Grandma's library remained exactly as she had left it. Even the half-finished crossword puzzle stayed on the coffee table beneath a glass frame. Not because I couldn't finish it, but because some stories deserved to remain exactly as the people we loved left them. The apartment buildings continued generating income. Rather than keeping every dollar for myself, I created the Eleanor Carter Foundation. Its mission was simple: to provide scholarships for students whose families couldn't afford higher education, to support elderly people living alone, and to offer legal assistance to seniors who believed they were being financially manipulated by relatives. Richard became the foundation's legal advisor. When I asked why he accepted without hesitation, he smiled. Eleanor spent her life protecting people. This lets her keep doing it. As for Daniel, he surprised everyone. A few weeks after the court ruling, he came to Grandma's house carrying a cardboard box. I found these in Dad's attic. Inside were dozens of old family photographs, letters, birthday cards, drawings I had made as a child. Grandma had saved every single one. Daniel looked at me with tears in his eyes. I believed everything Dad told me. "I'm sorry." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I hugged him. Not because the past had disappeared, but because someone had finally chosen truth over excuses. Sometimes, that's where healing begins. My mother wrote me several letters over the next year. The first few were filled with explanations. Then excuses. Then silence. Finally, one letter simply read, "I spent so many years trying to protect my husband that I forgot how to protect my children. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope one day you'll remember me for the moments before greed changed us." I folded the letter carefully. Some wounds heal slowly. Others leave scars forever. But scars don't have to define the rest of your life. My father accepted responsibility for what he had done. The court ordered him to repay the stolen funds that could be recovered and imposed the legal consequences for the forged documents and financial fraud. Years later, after he completed his sentence, he asked to meet me. We sat together on a quiet park bench. Neither of us knew what to say at first. Finally, he spoke. I kept thinking about Mom's last letter. I looked at him. Which part? He smiled sadly. Character is the only inheritance no one can steal. He wiped a tear from his cheek. I spent my whole life trying to leave my family money. I should have been trying to leave them integrity. For the first time in many years. I believed him. Every year on Grandma Eleanor's birthday, I returned to the old lighthouse. The hidden chamber was empty now. The steel lockbox had been placed in the Foundation's small museum, alongside copies of Grandma's letters. But one thing remained exactly where she left it. The words carved into the stone wall. Truth rises with the tide. I would stand there for a few minutes, listening to the waves crash against the cliffs, remembering the woman who refused to let fear write the final chapter of her life. One evening, while organizing Grandma's library, I discovered something I had somehow overlooked. Inside her favorite Bible was a tiny folded piece of paper. Just one sentence. Written in the same graceful handwriting I had come to know by heart. If you're reading this, Emma, then you finally understand. An inheritance isn't what people leave behind. It's what they leave inside the people they love. I held the note against my heart. And for the first time since Grandma's death, I didn't cry because I had lost her. I smiled. Because I realized she had never truly left. She had left behind something no forged signature, no altered will, and no amount of greed could ever take away. Her courage. Her wisdom. Her love. And that was the only inheritance that truly mattered. Sometimes the greatest battles in a family aren't fought over money, they're fought over values. Grandma Eleanor knew that wealth could be stolen, documents could be forged, and trust could be broken. But she also knew that integrity outlives every fortune. If this story moved you, let it be a reminder, the legacy we leave isn't measured by what we own, but by the lives we change. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were Emma?